So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yirmiyahu the prophet, we find in the layer of understanding of the time of the restoration period. This means from 2009 and onwards until the starting of the spring feast. We find then the understanding of these starting of the spring feast related with the holy feasts of the Creator. We find then our quest in understanding until the closing of the age. So then, for us to understand the time of the restoration, then we must understand then the completion of the spring feast. Gospels, they do not exist. So let's understand then how then time is related with tabernacling and the Gentile level. So then we find ourselves understanding then when Moshe received the holy instructions and he was told it would come in the future a prophet and then the nation should listen. So then he came. He completed then half of the instructions. Leviticus the 23rd chapter gives you the understanding of the holy mikras or the feasts. The year then is subdivided by many feasts, then mostly spring feast and autumn feast. Then we find ourselves then understanding that the time of the restoration until we understand first then the spring feast, half of it, and then the other half explaining then the autumn feast. So the 61st chapter of Yirmiyahu gives you the starting point of it, of the spring feast. Then there is a section related with the autumn feast. So the 61st chapter relates first with spring and then autumn. As far as only the time of the restoration prior of the starting of the autumn feast, then we find ourselves then during this time. So then, from this viewpoint, there is the world's temptations regarding then the holy agenda. The holy agenda was then described by Daniel the prophet. Daniel the 11th chapter gives you then the clear understanding of the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south, the Soviet Union and Africa. And then you find the kingdom of the east that must be secluded because of the understanding of Daniel. Then a couple of chapters later, found in the Apocrypha, the understanding of Baal and the dragon. The dragon must remain itself secluded because it's always precision. What this means is then the very clear understanding simultaneously of what it means then tabernacling. It doesn't mean the dragon is holy. It does not mean whatsoever. It means there is a distinction from what is Baalian and what is then dragon. This then plays out when you read then Revelation later, or Galah. When the combat of the end starts, then you understand what it means, the Baalian system, and then the chief Baalian system, where it comes from, how it relates with the holy cities, and then traded at the same time. You will understand later. But at the moment we must then recognize China must remain then secluded, only factoring. But then comes the temptation of not doing it. So there is an article related with the Soviet Union back in 2010 related with shipbuilding in the Northern Kingdom. There is a very nicely specified investment in shipbuilding. This plan is absolutely in line with the instructions, because then we find these understandings in line with much equipment. So then we find solid ground. We understand there are other countries building ships, but those are clay comparing with the Northern Kingdom. It takes some time to get used to it, but then the advantage of the Northern Kingdom is they are on a holy instructions. Africa is the Southern Kingdom on a holy instructions, so also the East. So then the Northern Kingdom must take a risk. They must believe they are on the scripture, and it's very clear. And then taking risks. So then let's understand what goes on in Brazil, for instance. The ships in Brazil, the merchant navy is not very big, roughly 136 ships from the last data. So then, understanding the amount of ships of Brazil, and then obviously the sizes are very modest of those ships, you can understand then the materials then being smelted, and then obviously Brazil would simply go north and then go to the Panama Canal. From there then to China. Since we understand freighting is going to be extremely important, and let's say for instance China wants to remain what it is. Let's say they refuse to do what's on instructions, because China has a specific chapter only for itself in the Balian system. But let's say they refuse to do what's on instructions. Then there is a second understanding in line with it. It's not refusing the first, it's coming. But then the second portion of it is related with what the Messiah has said regarding freighting. The 8th chapter of Galah or Revelation states then, and the freighters of the earth, they are in charge. What can we understand of the Northern Kingdom? Taking risks, building ships, freighting, freight companies. There is a set plan with people related with the 6 digits, a person with a lot of wealth, interested then in becoming one with the state or a state-owned United Shipbuilding Corporation. It already shows you the linkage with freights or freighters, and then state, and then transportation. So you can find these understandings already lining up. So let's understand the second section of it. China is making deals with Europe and making deals with Africa. Understandable. These areas are very troublesome at the moment because Europe is related with the Eurozone. We yet don't know what's going to be the end of it, of the Eurozone. Who is going to get what or not going to get. And then Africa, always troublesome. Land of the fierce, mostly. So then, the temptation of not doing what's on the instructions is always present. But then let's evaluate the consequences. We understand these instructions are solid. They were given more than 2,500 years ago. A long time. So there is absolutely, definitely a divine hand behind it. So let's explore then when countries do not harmonize themselves with instructions. During this time is very deadly. Deadly in the sense of understanding the investments then in lost investments. Because the temptation works contrary when the divine is giving directives. It's not only working halfway, it's not working whatsoever. In other words, it's stealing. Because when divine guidance is given, then the other side, when it's not then in line and harmonious, it takes the wrong turn. This means Africa becomes very unstable, Europe becomes very unstable, and we already have signs of these when then Germany removed the gold deposits. There is an article regarding then the gold removal of US and also France. So it's indicating troubles. So then on top of it, when you have, for instance, China dealing with the Eurozone and the US monetary system at the same time, plus Africa, and their dealings not being harmoniously in line with instructions, cocktail of danger. They may not think this way at the moment because the system is somewhat stable, but showing signs of wear. But then we find the Northern Kingdom given the promise of leadership. Unquestionable. If you read the understanding of Daniel the 11th chapter, gives you then the iron nations of the time of the restoration period. At some point, systems are going to break, and then China must make a deal with the Northern Kingdom. There is no way out of it. And the refusal of doing so is going to cause a lot of trouble. There are already multiple problems in Africa. And the more time goes by, the worse it gets. It's going to come a point where the fierce people are going to become so fierce, China has to get out of there. Because we must understand why. There is the 11th chapter of Daniel where a couple of fierce people, they are then relating with each other. It does not give you the understanding of the east, only the north and the south. The most iron, fierce types of people. Now read the instructions, 11th chapter of Daniel. But then the east is then secluded because there was given a chapter in a specific understanding. You find then the dragon, and you can then link up this time with Galad, the 20th chapter. There's a section of it related with the dragon. Then you relate with it a specific layer of understanding of the dragon and the Balian system, Babylonian system. Then the world understands there is precision in the world, not related with tabernacling. So then when we read Job and the remark of the Creator as far as Nahashatan, he was perfect. We understand precision, perfection in terms of precision. So then those layers are then completed. So during this time, when we read then the article from the Soviet Union regarding then the state-owned United Shipbuilding Corporation, and then USC after Alexander Buzalkov, then this article from 2010 gives us then the standby condition of the shipbuilding in the Soviet Union. Because the building of these merchant ships is related with freighting, and we find the freighters of the earth in charge, then starts then the military might of the Soviet Union via these freighting companies, or producing ships for freight. So then the linking of the system then has started. There is a dedicated chapter of the Kingdom of the North and the South, and a dedicated chapter of China and the Balian system. Then the Messiah speaks in the future regarding then the freighters of the earth. Then you find the article related with shipbuilding for merchant reasons. Thus you begin to understand the engine of the Chinese system. Because Europe and North America must be defined. At some point must be defined. And as we understand, the monetary system of US global-wise must be then retrieved. Because the 11th chapter does not give us the influence of the West. It gives us North and South, and then the East secluded. This means there is a management system in the North where then the Chinese, they only receive the materials already prepared for them. So it's much more advantageous. Why? Because the volume. You must think of volume. So far, the market is mostly related with the niceties. Diplomatic conversations, going to a country, then you visit with the leaders of the country, and then the formalities, and then the conversations, and then the banking linkages, and then what should be done and what not. Then they make a contract. This takes time. While the nations yet they are producing themselves for the most part, but the dependency of the products of China is becoming much more evident. So then, understanding when the system starts then from north, east and south via the BRICS, then we become more acquainted with volume. Because the situation in the future is not then not making deals with China. Other countries making direct deals with China. It's the lack of time. The leaders going over there, finding time for it, and then they have to go over there. Then they stay in a hotel. Then they eat. Then they come together for a conference. Then there is the opening of the conference. And then each of them speaks. And then afterwards there is another lunch. And then each of them visiting with the President of China. Then they sign a document. Then more formalities. There is no more time for it. The volume demands quick responses. And the only way this can be achieved is by having a manager taking care of the details very fastly, very quickly. No BS anymore. And then volume. Then China becomes the factory of the world. But then there is a price. And the price is they don't have anymore the luxury of walking around as big shots. They have to get to work because of the volume. Because what the Messiah describes in Galah is the absolutely enormous amount of trade. This means volume. So then this time it is the perfect doldrum, let's say, where then the seas are very calm and no wind. Where these nations then can come together and get these resolved. Because after 36 months, then the situation is gone a whole lot worse. And then the economical, in quote, storm then comes, and then rather than doing it nicely, then becomes ups and downs. Yet the volume must be then given. So it started making sense. So the best time of having this deal of understanding the factory, the manager, and then the raw materials should start. That's the best time, while there are then other countries with their subsystems yet active. Because as we can understand, when the US system ruins, Africa is near going to starve. Because this country helps them so much with finances, is absolutely amazing. It's a huge amount of money. It's a mountain of money. But then without the US help, what is Africa going to do? They won't be able to have money for their infrastructure. Their services will become a whole lot more expensive. And then the regular money China was investing for the trade itself then obviously is going to be used for other reasons. So you can't simply write a contract and expect when you give the resources, then expect these resources to become what they placed on a contract. The African continent is going to be starving. Because the West is not found in the 11th chapter. Then Europe, absolutely certainty the Eurozone must be dismantled. There is no choice. Daniel said they would try to come together under a system of Nimrod. Nimrod had a system then of trade and religion at the same time. He was crazy. And then the Babylonian system, that's why it doesn't work. It's a Balian system. So let's say those countries where then China is making deals with, they find themselves during the dismantling of the Eurozone. Are these countries then going to provide what they had in a contract for? Obviously not. There are other priorities. So because of these decisions, you can start watching then China lost then deals with Africa, lost deals then in Europe, because these subsystems must be then retrieved from the world scenario, giving place then obviously of the whole instructions. So this time is very crucial for these kingdoms, northern, eastern, and southern. Then make sure they understand each other. But then China must start severing itself from the other countries. There is no solution. The volume of the future won't let them having so many tentacles or then so many linkages with other countries. The volume won't let. You know why? Because the subsystems must become unstable. This generates doubt in the market. The only way for the Chinese market to remain then stable is by hiring the services of the Northern Kingdom. There is no other solution. Because we must include the couple of extra chapters of Daniel. And it used to be in instructions, it was removed later. Then we understand very cleanly Babylonian system and the dragon system. So then, if China, because they are in a position of advantage, they don't make a move, then the Northern Kingdom must take a risk. The Northern Kingdom already understands they are in charge of the BRICS, including China. So as the Northern Kingdom takes leadership and takes risks and start acting as managers, Brazil has no condition of exportation because they have very few ships. Doesn't even amount to a couple hundred ships. Amazon, for the most part, is absolutely virgin yet. Twice the size of Texas, the state of Texas, United States. However, it is so vast and there are no roads. They are using the DC Douglas aircrafts from the time of the Second World War. Because the environment is very harsh. High humidity, very, very, very hot. And then you can understand some areas of the Amazon, as you can understand, you can fly over there, you can find it. Sometimes you fly over areas where you have a huge, vast area with no vegetation. You know what are those? Minerals coming out of the ground. You know what this means? To make it easier until roads are built, until then, aircrafts. For instance, the heavy-duty Antonov aircrafts over there in Africa, already using it for this purpose. So you can simply imagine an area over there very far away, in the midst of the Amazon, where those minerals are at, then a simple airstrip where then the Antonovs can land, get the minerals, and then pay the Brazilian government. But then as we read the article of USC, the state-owned United Shipbuilding Company of the Soviet Union already had lined up their shipbuilding projects. So then we can understand why the Soviet Union then later becomes the place with much equipment. And this understanding has the backing up of heaven. That's the most important part of it. As these nations or these kingdoms, they make a move harmoniously with instructions, it is absolutely certainty it will work. So time to own the title and then start up shipbuilding, aircraft building. Then comes the relationship of Mr. Putin and Mr. Zuma. because the Antonovs and lots of Soviet equipment, they are already in Africa. So they are familiar with the region and the way they work. But then is the understanding of a formality of the kingdom of the north is speaking with the kingdom of the south, and then the kingdom of the south earning the responsibility. Then it's no longer the kingdom of the north's responsibility of guiding everybody every time. Otherwise a person goes crazy. Now, has to have from leader to leader, and then Mr. Zuma in turn visits with the other leaders of the African continent. And then he makes a project of what it would take to get those minerals out of the mines. Either by trucking, or then by flying, or then by ships. But then comes the order. Must have these number of materials by this date, and they must be smelted and ready for use. Then the principle used in Africa then is used in Brazil, obviously. Because the whole northern of Brazil plus a few countries, for instance, Colombia, and then the Amazon area of the northern side would be obviously related with Mercosur, very known, but then beyond this, then the Kingdom of the North also manages the BRICS. But it is absolutely imperative these first, second, and third kingdoms owning their roles. They have titles per instructions. In acting as, they must act as they were described. There is a leader of the north, a leader of the east, and a leader of the south. The leader of the south was already given. Joseph Zuma from South Africa. He has the responsibility then of uniting the entire continent of Africa. So the whole African continent used to be in confusion, in a very short time got organized. There is no more temptation coming from any direction. For instance, China, they're not going to Congo anymore, or Rwanda, or then other areas of Africa trying to start up trade. Because this means confusion. This means then the dragon making deals with the Balian system. It doesn't work. If you read then a couple of chapters later, you'll find Baal and the dragon. And then the northern kingdom must own the responsibility as managers. But it's not micromanaging. A simple glance at the person say, are you able to do the task? Visiting with the other leaders and make sure we get this number of materials by this date. God Almighty, if a person doesn't know how to take this order, then retarded. But then China has to exclude itself from the rest of it, because we are already preparing for the volume. The problem is not making deals, the problem is the volume. China won't be able to hold the volume if they spread their tentacles everywhere. They got so many politics and junk in the midst of it, they won't be able to get the demand. Because there are principles of formation. When we read Galah, the Messiah spoke then in the 8th chapter of Galah. He said, in the freighters of the earth. And then, chapter 1:8, he warns his people during this time of the restoration to resume the second tabernacle services. And then he gives a glimpse of the future and the traders of the earth. He speaks of then the number of, items they were for sale, frankincense and so on and so forth, and ships everywhere. Because what China must understand is this: they are no longer in charge. The diplomacy was given to the Kingdom of the North. China is responsible for the volume. It does not mean that China won't be able to give inputs of what they want. No, they do say what they want. If they want a deal with Brazil, they voice it out to the manager. Manager, can you make a deal with Brazil? We want this, 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 this. Can it be done? Give some time. Let the Kingdom of the North think, verify the situation, what he has as far as ships, what he can do, how much it's going to take, transportation. Then a short while later, he gives, yes, can be done. Then they get to work. So China has a direct relationship with the manager where they can get whatever they want. As far as what they do then increases the market and the volume, so more people can buy and can invest. It does not mean seclusion and not able to make any opinion. Come on. They have the resources, so they have the say in a situation. But then the volume coming is extremely big. Because when the Messiah mentioned of ships, he meant a lot of ships. So then we understand an organization in the system where then nations later, when they are linked up with the Chinese system, they are at ease or they are relaxed. They don't have to go these ups and downs of the market for so long. The problem is the market is up and down so many times and people don't understand what it means harmony anymore. And since the Panama Canal is not yet finished, it would be very prudent for the Kingdom of the North making friendship with the Panama Canal. You know why? Because rather than only being a canal, making out of it a trading post. They have a gorgeous area over there of the river where ships can be parked very securely, very easily. They can drop anchor, they are secured, and then making trade post. And it's very simple because they can use the modification of a ship. For instance, we understand Soviet Union has a plan from the state-owned United Shipbuilding Corporation where there are investors. But then rather than using regular ships, they can use, for instance, very simple system, using the elevation of the water as a means of elevator. So let's say, for instance, a ship goes through the canal and very quickly unloads the cargo. Rather than taking from above, the ships can be then used as if the side of the ship would open and railroad sideways would remove the entire cargo at once, or modules of these. So you have then the center point of the ship, rather than being in a bow at the stern, can become then the center. Then the front, purely then freight, the back of the ship, purely freight, is no longer removing container by container. It's crazy. That's the technology of the 50s. Those containers must be, in quote, bunched up together in very big squares, where then when the ship goes into the canal, then the elevation of the water is in line sideways with the railroad track. So the side of the ship then opens, and then the entire cargo goes out at once. Then the railroad tracks takes the entire cargo, or then a great portion of it, and directly goes into the distribution center. So there are no trucks waiting around. From the port, it goes straight through then the distribution center. Those trucks are there. So the area of the loading and unloading is very open wide. Then from the other side of the ship comes in the loading. A person can easily make a retractable side gate, for instance. So the Soviets, they have this great plan ever since 2010. But then what can be built are those modern ships, not regular built for cargo of the 50s, but building modern ships, sideways loading, driving through systems, using the water elevation. Can you imagine how cheap this system becomes? You don't have to have those hoists anymore. It's simple, drive through, then lines the ship with the water level. Then there are railroad tracks on both sides, port side and then starboard side. Starboard side unloads, port side loads. And then the gates simply they close and driving through. So the Soviets, they have a huge market in front of them, but then they have to come up with very practical ships. No longer those guides, every time comes down then a container, and came from an American designer of the 50s. But it's cumbersome. If we relate the volume coming versus then the technology of the 50s, come on. You can't have every time and have a guide in a ship, and then how many stores goes up? Each of them must be lined up. It's a waste of time. It's crazy. Must have a system where they can be used then the water as the elevator. So the Soviets, they got the entire technology at their disposal. But then takes a conversation from Mr. Putin and the Panamanian government. They have to work out a deal during this time, because yet the canal is not ready, so it can be easily modified. So the fewer ships from Brazil, roughly a couple hundred of them, when the time comes, they can start making the route. But then has to have a standardization of the kind of ships that the Soviet Union should produce for their benefit to become a standard worldwide. Because as the volume increases, for instance, the ports of Singapore and China, they won't be able to handle the demand anymore. When the system becomes available worldwide, can you imagine what's going to become of those ports? Line of ships waiting because it takes a long time. The freighter ship Atlanta, there was a special documentary on television quite some time ago. To unload and load only 2,200 containers would take more than 20 hours. $20 hours, 2,200 containers? That is absolutely crazy. Should be under 2 hours. Because the technology of shipbuilding is very antiquated. It's an antique. Have to hoist then container by container. They have to line up each of them. It's absolutely a waste of time. When the Soviets, they come up with a system where then gates, then they open sideways. Then they use the water elevation. A whole section of a big square with a great number of containers, they come out at once. It doesn't even have to use a crane. And then as the starboard side unloads, then obviously has to unload the front and then unload the back. Make sure the distribution of weight gets done properly. Or then the ship must be locked in place. But those are easy calculations. In these modern days, it's very easy doing it. The computer can do the calculation. Let's say, for instance, the central directive of the ship then is in the center. You have the front, you have the bow and the stern. When you park the ship in its proper position, can be locked in place. Locking mechanisms then locks the ship where it's at. Then you remove very gently bow and stern at the same time. So the weight is distributed. But then the ship on both sides is locked in place. It won't go anywhere. Unloads very quickly, and then loads very quickly, close the side gates, and then drive through. Obviously, this model would be used in New Zealand, trading post of the South Pacific. So that not only the experiment can be easily done in Panama Canal, can serve as then the model for the South Pacific. Finding over there an area of the coast of the ocean over there and blast it with dynamite, make sure they make a very nice drive-through port. And if the environments get in the midst of it, throw them with a dynamite. Let them explode together. They like the environment so much, let them throw themselves in a hole and throw dynamite over there. The environment recuperates. After the construction, some 5 years, then the fish are back. So the only country, thus far as we understand, or kingdom, at the very big risk is China, because of the volume coming. China won't be able to handle the management of the volume of the future. That's why when you understand the existing situation of the Soviet Union and the value of the ruble against the US monetary system, a ruble is not even at 10 cents. So when we read then Daniel the 11th chapter, how can this kingdom become then grander than previously? Well, the answers were given in instructions.